Have you ever waited for something, not because you needed it, but because it reminded you of someone you loved? There's an old man who sits on his porch every morning, watching the sky as if it holds a secret just for him. He doesn't check the weather. He doesn't look at the clock. He waits, patiently, silently, for the sound of distant thunder, the scent of wet earth, the hush of rain returning home. He's not waiting for the fields to grow again. He's waiting for something quieter, something softer, a memory, perhaps, wrapped in the rhythm of falling rain. Tonight we'll visit his world, a world of quiet porches and warm coffee, of worn letters and gentle silence, of love that lingers like the smell of rain on dry wood. So whenever you're ready, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and come sit with us under the eaves beside the man who waited for rain. There was a man who lived at this edge of a field, in a house that remembered everything. The porch knew the weight of his boots, the screen door knew the rhythm of his hands, and the wind, whenever it passed through the shutters, seemed to know how to speak his name. Not out loud, but in the quiet way memories speak when no one is looking. His name was Amos, and though his hair had long turned the color of riverstone, he still moved like the land moved, slow, steady, with purpose. Each morning, before the sun had fully shaken off the dew, Amos would step out onto the porch in his flannel shirt, buttoned up not because it was cold, but because Lena always said it looked proper that way. The air was still that morning, not heavy, just paused, as if the sky was holding its breath, not for a storm, but for something gentler. Amos lowered himself into the old rocking chair, the one with the worn cushion Lena had patched 4 times. He cradled a chipped white mug between his hands. The coffee inside was dark and quiet, just the way he liked it. No sugar, no cream, just something warm to hold while the world remembered how to wake up. Out past the porch, the field spread wide like a forgotten hymn. Tall grasses swayed without urgency, the color of wheat that had once been, now tinged with wildflowers and patches of stubborn clover. There were no crops anymore. No neat rows, no tractors chugging in the distance, just the field, as it was, left to grow as it pleased. Some might have called it overgrown, but Amos called it free. It had been 3 years since he last tilled that soil, not because his body couldn't, but because his heart no longer asked him to. When Lena passed, something in the field had fallen silent too. It wasn't grief exactly, not the loud kind, but more like a hush, a stillness that settled into the furrows and made itself at home. And so Amos let the land be. He still walked it, still knew where the ground dipped ever so slightly, where the earth turned soft after rain, where the deer liked to bed down beneath the cottonwoods. But he no longer planted, he waited. Mostly he waited for rain, not to water crops, not to fill barrels or soak the roots of anything useful. He waited because rain reminded him of her. There had been a time, long ago but not forgotten, when Lena would lean against a door frame in the evenings, watching the horizon with quiet hope. She'd know a storm was coming before anyone else, not by the sky, not by the wind, but by the way the birds went quiet and the way the trees held their leaves a little closer. "I think it'll rain tonight," she'd say, and Amos would smile because she was always right. They never minded the storms. The louder the thunder, the cozier the house seemed. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch as the rain came in sheets, watching the fields drink deeply. Sometimes they'd stay inside, listening to it drum against the roof. As they played cards or folded laundry slowly or did nothing at all, Rain had a way of softening everything. Arguments dissolved beneath it. So did silence. And when it was over, the world always smelled like forgiveness. Amos took a slow sip from his mug, watching a pair of sparrows hop along the fence line. The porch creaked beneath him, a familiar sound, more soothing than any clock. To his right, the wooden swing swayed gently, not pushed by wind, but by memory. He could still picture Lena sitting there, a blanket over her knees, book in her lap, barefoot even in autumn. "You should join me," she used to say, tapping the cushion beside her. "And do what?" he'd tease. "Nothing," she'd smile. "Just sit." So he did. Even now, years later, he sometimes caught himself turning toward the swing, as if she might still be there, waiting with that same patient smile. But the swing stayed empty, and the morning moved on. The sky above had begun to gather, not dark, but thoughtful. Clouds drifted in with no rush, settling into one another like neighbors on a long porch. Amos noticed. He always did. He leaned forward just slightly, mug still warm in his hands, eyes scanning the line of trees where the road disappeared. There was no forecast, no news bulletin, just the old man, the porch, and the possibility of rain. He didn't expect it, didn't demand it. He simply waited, and in the waiting he found a kind of peace. Somewhere deep in the meadow a cricket began to chirp, though the sun was still climbing, and farther off, just faint enough to wonder if he imagined it. The distant roll of thunder whispered through the sky. Amos didn't move, didn't smile. He just listened, the kind of listening that comes after many years, the kind that knows some things are meant to be felt, not spoken. He leaned back into the chair. It gave a long wooden sigh, like the house too was remembering something kind, and so the morning held still. The porch grew quiet. The sky darkened just a little, and Amos, he kept waiting, not because he was alone, but because even in the quiet, even in the absence, there was a kind of company in the rain. The rain didn't come that day. By afternoon, the sky had softened into a quiet gray, and the wind, which had stirred so gently in the morning, settled back into stillness. Like a dog resting its head on folded paws, Amos didn't mind. Waiting, he had learned, was its own kind of company. He remained on the porch long after the sun had reached its peak, the coffee in his mug now cold, but still cradled carefully between his fingers, as if warmth might return if he held it long enough. Inside the house, the grandfather clock chimed twice, a mellow old sound that seemed to echo through the floorboards. Amos turned his head just slightly at the sound. He didn't wear a watch anymore, not since Lena passed. She was the keeper of time, he once said to a neighbor. She knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest, and when to speak. I reckon I just followed her seasons. Now, the hours came and went like the wind across the field, soft, forgetful, and mostly kind. He rose slowly from the chair, the movement unhurried, as if his bones had learned to stretch with care. The porch steps, sun-warmed and slightly bowed, greeted him like old friends. Each creaked underfoot, offering no complaint, only the familiar whisper of age. The door swung open with a click and closed behind him with the soft whoosh of screen against frame. The house smelled like cedar and old paper, with a trace of something sweeter, perhaps a lavender drawer, sachets Lena had tucked away decades ago. It was a small house, really, just 3 rooms and a lean-to porch, but it held more life than any mansion he'd ever seen. He walked through it not as a man who owned it, but as a man who belonged to it. Each object seemed to hum with memory, The kitchen table with its worn corners, the faded rug in the sitting room, the cupboard door that stuck in the summer. He paused at the bookshelf, reaching out to trace the spine of an old volume. Lena's handwriting was still visible on the inside cover. To Amos, for quiet days and quieter nights. All my love, L. He closed the book gently, as if not to wake her. That evening, Emma stood at the edge of the field. The wind had returned, soft and low, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and the promise of change. Beyond the fence, the meadow swayed in slow waves. Crickets had begun their chorus early, as if singing back the sun. He remembered how Lena used to walk through this field in late summer, her skirt brushing the tops of wild grasses, her fingers grazing the heads of Queen Anne's lace. She never walked quickly, Amos thought. She moved like she was listening. And maybe she was. She always said the land spoke if you knew how to listen. And Amos, in all his years beside her, had learned to hear it too. The field hadn't been tilled since she left, but it still welcomed him like it always had. The ground beneath his boots was soft, not from rain, but from time. He reached the place near the willow tree, their favorite spot, where they'd often sat on a wool blanket, watching clouds or listening to the frogs in the creek nearby. There, nestled among the roots, was the bench he had built with her help, the wood weathered and silvered with years. He sat down slowly, hands resting on his knees, eyes on the horizon. The sun was low now, casting a gentle amber light across the grass. A dragonfly hovered nearby, its wings catching the light like stained glass. Amos smiled. Lena had once told him that dragonflies were reminders, small messengers that flickered in and out of our days to remind us of what we almost forgot. Maybe she was right. She usually was. He sat there a long time, watching the world slow down. No one called, no one came, but he was not alone, not in the field, not in the hush of dusk, not with the scent of dry hay drifting in the breeze. Later, back inside, he lit a small lamp near the window. Its light was golden and soft, casting long, familiar shadows on the wooden walls. He made a simple supper, cornbread, apples, and a bit of sharp cheese. Lena's recipes still lived in a drawer beside the sink, handwritten in pencil on flour-dusted cards. He didn't need to read them. He remembered them all. The kitchen felt fuller in the lamplight, like the room itself had memory and was glad to be used again. Amos sat at the table, eating slowly, each bite a quiet ritual. Outside, the night pressed gently against the windows, not menacing, but tender, like a blanket pulled up to the chin. After supper, he returned to the porch. The air had cooled, but not enough for a jacket, just enough to remind him that another season was on its way. The stars began to appear, not all at once, but carefully, as if testing the silence. He leaned back into the chair, listening. No rain, not yet, but the breeze carried the scent of damp leaves, and somewhere far off, a tree branch creaked in the wind, the kind of sound that makes you feel safe, because it means the world is still turning. Amos closed his eyes, not to sleep, not yet, just to rest, to listen, to wait, because waiting, he had learned, was not the absence of doing. It was its own kind of devotion. That night, Amos dreamed, not the kind of dream that startled the heart, nor the kind that slipped away too quickly upon waking. It was more like a memory, one that had been sleeping quietly in some back room of the mind, waiting for its name to be spoken again. In the dream, he was younger, not young exactly, but still strong in the arms and quick in the steps. Lena was there, She was standing in the kitchen, her back turned to him, humming something low and familiar as she kneaded dough on the wooden counter. The windows were open, and from outside came the gentle hush of summer rain. Not a downpour, not even a storm, just a slow, soaking rain that tapped the leaves and gathered in the eaves, dripping one drop at a time into the tin buckets below. It was one of those late July rains, the kind that didn't announce itself with thunder, just arrived quietly, like a friend who knew the way in. Lena turned and smiled at him, and in that dream smile was everything. Flower on her cheek, loosened braid falling over her shoulder, that warmth in her eyes that made the whole house feel like it was lit from within. "You came in just before I started," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "Did you feel it coming?" Amos nodded, and in the dream, he could smell it again. That unmistakable scent of rain on dry earth, rich and grounding, like the land itself sighing in relief. He woke slowly, the image of her still lingering behind his closed eyelids. Outside, the world was quiet, no rain, just the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint rustle of leaves outside his bedroom window. He stayed in bed longer than usual, letting the memory settle like silt in clear water. There was no need to rush. The day would wait for him, just as he had always waited for it. When he did rise, he moved through the morning with quiet hands. He made coffee the old way, in the blue enamel pot she had favored, waiting patiently for the boil, then letting it rest, just as she had taught him. He poured it into the same chipped mug, the one she used to say had the best lip for sipping. And then, like every morning, he stepped out onto the porch. The light was soft, filtered through a thin layer of clouds that stretched like linen across the sky. The air held a coolness beneath its warmth, a sign that the season was beginning its slow tilt toward fall. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Birdsong rose from the hedgerow, punctuated by the occasional call of a distant crow. The field beyond the porch shimmered slightly, as if the grasses themselves had stirred in greeting. Amos sat down. The chair creaked the way it always did. The porch boards accepted his weight like a blessing, and he breathed, a long, slow breath, the kind that doesn't need to say anything out loud. The day passed with little fanfare. Amos brought in firewood from the shed, stacked it neatly beside the stove. Though the nights were still far from cold, he tended the garden out back, not the kind of garden that grows to sell, but the kind that grows to remember. There were no rows, no labels, just patches of things Lena had once loved: lavender, rosemary, nasturtiums, and chamomile. He knelt in the dirt beside the sage, trimming gently, brushing his fingers through the soft leaves. The scent clung to his skin. He thought of the time she had bundled herbs in the kitchen, hanging them upside down to dry above the window, letting their fragrance drift through the rooms all summer long. Back then, he had thought it quaint, maybe even unnecessary. But now he understood. There were things you grew not to eat, not to use, but simply to be near them, to remember their shape, their smell, their season. By late afternoon, Amos found himself on the porch again. The clouds had thickened, but still held their quiet. A breeze picked up, cooler than before, carrying with it a faint scent of rain from somewhere far off. Not here, not yet, but coming. He closed his eyes, not to nap, just to listen. And what he heard was not silence, but fullness, the whisper of wind through tall grass, the soft creak of the porch swing in its chains, the distant sigh of the earth, as if the land itself was waiting too. In the drawer beside his chair was a box, worn at the corners, its edges softened from years of touch. Inside, tucked beneath old letters and folded linens, were the rain diaries. Lena had started them in their first year of marriage. Each time it rained, she would note the date, the time it began, how long it lasted, and a few lines about what the world had looked like while it happened. June 3rd, just before supper, light rain, frogs louder than the thunder. Amos forgot his hat. October 12th, afternoon drizzle, leaves falling like confetti, baked cornbread, listen to radio. They were small notes, barely more than fragments, but as Amos turned the pages now, they felt weightier than any journal of history. Each line carried with it the whole room, the sound of the stove, the dampness in the corners, the shared glance across the table. He ran his finger along one entry, dated simply, August, late rain. Window open, fell asleep to the sound of it. He remembered that night. He remembered the open window, the way the curtains had billowed inward, the cool air on their skin, and Lena's breath, steady beside him. They hadn't spoken. There was no need. Some nights speak for themselves. As the sun began to dip, the first drop landed on the tin roof, then another, and another. Amos didn't move. The sound grew, not fast, not sudden, just steady, a long-awaited rhythm returning to its place. He sat in the hush of it, wrapped not in memory, but in presence. The porch became a chapel, the field a sea, and Amos, the quiet keeper of it all. He closed the rain diary gently, set it on the small table beside him, and watched as the world turned silver in the twilight. The rain stayed through the night. It didn't shout. It didn't sweep in with drama or fury. It just stayed. A long, steady hush, falling in ribbons across the roof, gathering softly along the windowsills and soaking deep into the earth. Amos didn't sleep much that night, but that wasn't unusual. Sleep had become a visitor, not a resident. It came when it pleased and left before sunrise. He didn't mind. The rain was good company. Lying there in bed, he listened to the water slip from leaf to leaf, trickle through the gutters, and pool gently near the porch steps. The rhythm of it reminded him of breath, not his own, but hers. Lena had breathed like that when she slept, soft and even, like the world itself was resting through her. He turned slightly in the bed, facing the empty side, and let his hand rest there, flat against the blanket where her body had once made its shape. The sheets had long since lost her scent, but his fingers remembered the warmth. When morning came, the rain had lessened to a mist, a fine silver veil hanging over the field and trees. The whole world seemed quieter, like a church after the hymn has ended. Amos rose slowly, his joints stiff from stillness, and made his way to the kitchen. The stove clicked softly as it warmed. The kettle hissed before it sang. Outside the window, a squirrel darted across the railing, its tail trailing like a banner of mischief. He smiled at it. It paused to look at him, then vanished into the branches. The coffee tasted stronger than usual, or maybe he was just more awake than usual. He poured the second cup not out of habit, but because the mug still sat there, the one with the blue floral rim, chipped slightly on one side. It had been hers. He placed it across from his own on the kitchen table, just like he used to. No words, no explanation, only that small act of setting a cup for someone who no longer needed it. But he did. That morning he opened the drawer beside the sink, not the drawer for cutlery, but the one beneath, where loose envelopes, ballpoint pens, and rubber bands had gathered over the years like driftwood on a quiet riverbank. He pulled out a stack of old stationery, cream-colored pages with a faint blue border, the kind they'd used to write letters when they were young, before phones were common, before everything became fast. He hadn't used one in years, but the weight of the paper felt good in his hand. It felt proper. He brought it to the table and sat. The window beside him was fogged slightly from the morning chill. Outside, the branches dripped slowly, as if reluctant to let the rain go. He picked up the pen, let it rest between his fingers a moment. Then he began. Dear Lena, it rained last night. The words came slowly, not because he didn't know what to say, but because there was no rush. Each line settled into the page like footprints in soft earth. It started around dusk, just a few drops on the roof, then steady through the evening, the kind you used to like, gentle but long enough to matter. He paused, looking out the window. I thought of you, of course. I think of you every time it rains, every time I hear the porch creak or smell coffee in the morning, or see the first wildflowers come up through the grass. He scratched gently at the paper, not to erase, just to feel the grain beneath his fingertips. The lavenders come back, not where we planted it, but near the fence, as if it wandered there on its own. I think you'd like that. The pen moved without hurry, each word a thread in the slow stitching of remembrance. I haven't been to church in a while, but I still sing the old hymns now and then, mostly on Sundays, sometimes while I'm sweeping the porch. He smiled faintly. Yesterday I found your thimble. It was in the little drawer of the sewing box, under the buttons. I held it a while. Funny how something so small can feel like a whole afternoon. He looked up, blinking softly. The rain had begun again, just a whisper on the window pane. I miss your voice. Not the words necessarily, just the sound of it in the house, the way it filled the quiet without needing to say much. He paused again, not to find the right words, but to let the moment be full. Anyway, I just wanted you to know, I'm still here. The porch still faces east, and I still wait for the rain. He didn't sign it. He folded the letter once, slid it into an envelope, but didn't seal it. He placed it in the small tin box by the lamp, the one that held old matchbooks, a dried four-leaf clover, and the photo of them taken by the creek on a day when the light had caught her hair just so. He didn't expect anyone would read it, but it wasn't meant for reading. It was meant for writing, for remembering, for breathing, for keeping company with what remains. That evening, Amos lit a candle, just one, not because it was dark, but because it was gentle. The flame flickered in the soft air, casting shadows on the wall that looked for a moment like dancing. He sat with his supper, a bit of stew, a piece of bread, and a few slices of peach he'd saved from the last market trip. The meal tasted like late summer, and the silence tasted like home. When he finished, he left the dishes in the sink, a habit she would have teased him about. Then he stepped out once more onto the porch and let the night gather around him. The rain had stopped, but the earth still held the sound of it deep in its roots. Amos leaned back in the chair, hands resting on his lap, eyes on the field now cloaked in silver mist, and somewhere beneath the quiet, beneath the years, beneath all that had been said and unsaid, he felt her near, not as a ghost, not as a dream, but as something softer, like memory, like breath, like rain. The next morning came in quietly, as if it didn't want to wake the world too quickly. The air was still cool from the night's rain, and a pale light rested gently across the porch, slipping in through the screens and laying itself like silk over the wooden floorboards. Amos was already awake. He had been up before the sun, not out of urgency, but because some mornings simply ask for stillness. He had sat at the edge of the bed a long while, watching the soft shape of light creep across the floor, listening to the faint sounds of the house coming to life. A groan from the beams, the hush of wind moving through eaves, and the low tick of the clock near the door. He moved slowly through his morning as always, washing up at the basin, brushing his hair, buttoning his shirt all the way to the collar, though there was no one to impress. Lena had once said, "You dress like the morning might have something to say to you." He still did. It had been some time since Amos had walked into town, but that morning, as the clouds thinned into threads of white and the smell of damp earth rose like a hymn from the fields, he felt the old roads call to him. He packed a small satchel, a book, a handkerchief, an apple from the tree out back. Then he stepped out into the new-washed world. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. The hedgerows were heavy with drops, their leaves glistening in the softened sun. A pair of mourning doves fluttered from a low branch, cooing gently as they passed overhead. Amos tipped his hat to no one in particular. It was a habit. He'd always greeted the road. The path to town wound gently between fields and fences, past barns painted with stories, and mailboxes that had known the same families for 3 generations. It wasn't far, a mile and a half maybe, but Amos walked it like a man with nowhere else to be. Each step felt familiar, not just in body, but in memory. Here was the bend where Lena had once tripped and laughed so hard she couldn't get up. Here, the old maple tree where they'd rested in the shade, sharing a jar of lemonade, her head on his shoulder, their fingers loosely laced. Here, the spot where she had once stopped him to point at a rabbit nest tucked in the grass and whispered, "The world is always quieter than we think." He slowed near that place, not to mourn, but to remember. There's a difference. The town was small, a single intersection, 3 shops, and a church with a bell that rang once at noon and once again at dusk. The streets were still wet, puddles collecting in the places they always had. Amos stepped around them, not out of necessity, but out of long habit. A memory of Lena's voice saying, "No need to get your socks wet for nothing." He smiled at the thought and crossed toward the general store. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, a sound that hadn't changed in 40 years. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of flower, twine, and a faint trace of peppermint. Old fans turned slowly overhead, pushing the scent of wooden shelves and time-worn labels into the warm, quiet corners of the store. Behind the counter stood Margaret, her hair grayer now, but her eyes just as quick. "Well," she said with a wide smile, "look what the rain washed in." Amos tipped his hat. "Mornin', Margaret. Haven't seen you in a spell," she said, already reaching for the small paper bag she always filled with lemon drops. He held up a hand gently. "Just passing through today. Thought I'd stretch my legs a bit." She nodded, but her face softened as she studied him. "You look well, Amos, and the rain suits you." He nodded again. Words weren't always needed. Margaret passed him a small biscuit from the tin by the register. "On the house," she said. "Lena used to say a walk should end with something sweet." He took it carefully, as though it might crumble from memory alone. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now. "She was right, as usual." He sat on the bench outside the store a while, watching the town move in its quiet rhythms. Children passed on bicycles, tires splashing through the puddles with delight. A dog lay curled beneath the post office steps, sniffing at the air but too lazy to rise. The breeze had picked up just slightly, ruffling the leaves, lifting the corner of an old newspaper near the curb. Amos peeled the biscuit in half, tasting the hint of honey baked inside, and let the sun warm his shoulders. From here, he could see the church spire, still white, still tall. He remembered Sundays with Lena on this same bench, waiting for the service to begin, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes scanning the sky like she was watching for something beautiful to descend quietly without ceremony. They hadn't been devout, but they had been faithful to each other, to the land, to the slow goodness of shared days. By late morning, Amos rose again. He walked past the bakery where Lena once bought bread from a woman who spoke in whispers, past the feed store where they'd bought seed for spring, and once a kitten they hadn't planned to keep. He waved to a man painting his porch, nodded to a woman sweeping her walk. There were no long conversations, but each small gesture felt like being gently touched on the shoulder by the past, not to pull him back, but to remind him he still belonged. The walk home was slower. The sun had grown a little warmer, but the world still felt soft, like it hadn't quite dried from the rain and maybe didn't want to. At the edge of the field, Amos stopped. The grasses there bent lazily, still heavy with the last of the drops. A butterfly danced between them, its wings fragile but sure. He watched it for a long time, until it landed on a stalk of goldenrod, quivering gently in the breeze. It reminded him of something Lena once said while tending the flowers. "We don't need to leave big things behind, Amos. Just little ones that float when we're gone." He tipped his hat again, to the butterfly, to the wind, to the road behind him. Then he stepped back onto the porch, the boards sighing beneath his boots, welcoming him home like they always had. The house was still when Amos returned, the kind of stillness that didn't feel empty, but rather settled, like bread dough left to rise, or a book laid open, waiting for its next page. He stepped inside and placed his satchel on the old bench by the door. The air was warm with the smell of wood and linen, carried in on the soles of his boots, and the way the sun had rested all day on the floorboards. Outside, the light had begun to shift. It was the hour between light and dark, when the sun lingers just a little longer as if reluctant to leave, and the sky deepens into a kind of gentle hush. Amos took off his hat and set it on the hook by the door. Then he moved through the house, not to do anything in particular, but simply to be among the rooms. He lit a lamp in the front sitting room, the one with the lace curtains Lena had sewn from old flour sacks, carefully stitched with tiny roses. The lamp's light didn't chase away the dusk, but wrapped itself into it, glowing softly like something remembered. He stood by the window for a while, watching as the field outside turned golden gray and the sky ripened into evening. The rain had left its mark on the world. The gravel path still held puddles, and the gutters hummed softly with the last of the runoff. The trees dripped in slow rhythm, like clocks that didn't care about time. A small bird sang once, then fell quiet, its song drifting across the open air like a question that didn't need an answer. Amos took a deep breath, not to fill his lungs, but to remember the way the earth smelled after rain, the way the house sounded in twilight, the way Lena used to stand in this very room, folding clean dish towels and humming half a hymn she never quite finished. He turned from the window and walked to the bookshelf. It leaned ever so slightly now, as if age had made it humble. He ran his fingers along the spine, stopping at a worn leather-bound journal, one of Lena's old gardening logs. She had kept them for years, each one cataloging what bloomed when, what thrived in dry summers, what withered in late frost. But her notes were more than records. They were conversations. April 7th, the tulips returned today. I thought of Mother. May 14th, the beans are coming up. Amos says it'll be a good season. I trust him. August 2nd, rain at last. The cucumbers are grateful. So am I. He sat down in the old armchair near the lamp, opened the book to the middle, and read her handwriting out loud, slowly, like prayer. There was no audience, no echo, but in reading her words, he felt her presence settle into the room, like the way dust dances in late light. Later, he boiled water for tea. He used the same kettle she always had, its handle warm and worn from years of use. He added a few sprigs of chamomile from the bundle hanging by the window, then poured the tea into the small ceramic cup with the tiny green leaf painted inside the rim. Lena had chosen that cup for him, said it was the right weight for holding without fuss. He carried the cup back to the sitting room and settled once more into the chair, his legs stretched out in front of him, his hands wrapped loosely around the heat. The tea was quiet, not strong, not sweet, but steady, like her. As darkness thickened outside, he didn't rush to light the rest of the house. He let the one lamp glow, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor, like the arms of the evening. He listened, to the wind pressing softly against the glass, to the house sighing in its wooden bones, to the tick of the old wall clock, steady and slow. Then he reached for the drawer of the side table, the one that held old pens, envelopes, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. He untied them gently, spreading them on the table like fallen leaves. Some were from her, some were to her. All were written when days still felt long and promises didn't need to be spoken aloud. He picked one at random and opened it. My dearest, today I planted marigolds by the porch. I know you think they're too yellow, but they catch the light in a way that makes me think of summer when we were young. He smiled. She had been right about the marigolds. They were too yellow, and also perfect. Outside, the sky had turned indigo. The stars had begun to arrive, not in a rush, but one by one, like friends showing up after a long day, bringing nothing but their quiet presence. Amos stood, taking the cup with him to the porch. He didn't bother with the coat. The air was cool, but kind. The field glowed faintly beneath the starlight, each blade of grass a quiet witness to all the days that had passed. He sat in the rocking chair. It groaned gently under his weight, then settled into the rhythm it knew best. Slow, even, unbothered, he sipped the last of the tea, then closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest, to listen to the sounds that only come when the world has nothing left to say. A cricket sang near the steps, an owl called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance a breeze moved through the tall grass, like a hand brushing a memory. Amos didn't speak. He just rocked, and in the dark, in the hush, in the soft cradle of night, he waited, not for answers, not for change, but for the comfort of knowing that some things, like love and rain and the light of a single lamp in a quiet house, return in their own time. The next morning broke with the pale hush of early autumn. The sky held that gentle brightness that comes after several days of soft rain. not brilliant, but softened, as if the light itself had passed through linen. Amos rose as he always did, slowly, quietly, letting the creak of the floorboards accompany him like an old tune played on a fiddle, too long out of tune to impress, but too well loved to put away. He moved through the morning with a kind of reverence, poured water for the kettle, fed the birds with a scoop of cracked corn he kept in an old coffee tin, wiped the dew from the porch railing with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. The house was still cool, but not cold, the kind of coolness that asked for socks, but didn't demand a fire. He ate a slice of bread with honey and watched the meadow stretch itself in the waking light. A pair of crows were hopping along the fence post, arguing softly over nothing at all, and for a long while, that was enough. He was sitting in the porch chair, book unopened on his lap, when he heard the sound of tires on gravel. Slow, steady, not urgent. He leaned forward just enough to see a small red car pulling into the bend of the drive, the one lined with wild asters and weeds that Lena had once threatened to clear but always let grow in the end. A moment later, a familiar figure stepped out, shutting the door gently behind her. Clara, his niece. She stood there for a second, looking at the house like it was a friend she hadn't seen in years, then smiled and waved, her overnight bag hanging from one shoulder, her boots damp from the field grass. Amos stood slowly, waved back, no need for rush. She walked towards him, her steps steady and sure. "Uncle," she said simply as she reached the porch. "Clara," he replied, his voice warm as a patchwork quilt pulled from storage. They embraced, not long, not tight, just enough to say what words could not. Inside, Clara set her bag beside the front room's couch and followed Amos into the kitchen. They moved like they'd done this before, because they had. Once or twice a year, Clara would drive down from the city, escaping her apartment, her clients, the buzz of phones and subway trains, and the endless noise of needing to be somewhere. Here, she could breathe, and Amos never asked for explanations. He just made tea and let her settle in at whatever pace her heart required. They drank quietly at the table, chamomile for her, black coffee for him. She traced the rim of the cup with her finger, looked out the window. "I forgot how quiet it is here," she said. "It's been practicing," Amos said with a small smile. She laughed, the same laugh her mother had, sharp at the start, then fading like wind over tall grass. "It smells the same too," she said, closing her eyes for a moment, "like old wood and rain." Amos nodded. "That's probably just the old wood leaking memories." She looked at him. Then, not the quick glance of city people who always seemed late for something, but a long, still gaze that felt like gratitude. "I missed it," she said. "You didn't leave it," Amos replied. "It's still here, just quieter without you." That afternoon, they took a walk down the same road Amos had walked the day before. She brought a scarf. He brought his hat. They said little, but silence was never empty between them. It had been Clara, years ago, who helped Amos sort through Lena's things. They had folded aprons together, tied bundles of letters, placed dried herbs into jars, with labels written in Lena's soft cursive. Clara had asked no questions then, and Amos had offered no stories he wasn't ready to tell. They had worked in a rhythm of shared respect for the woman who had held so much together with little more than grace and ordinary hands. As they passed the bend near the old maple tree, Clara stopped. "Do you remember," she said, "when Aunt Lena used to bring apple slices on walks?" Amos did. He could see her now, basket in hand, red scarf at her throat, offering slices like communion. She always said apples tasted better outdoors, Clara added. She said everything did, Amos said, and they smiled. The wind moved gently through the grass, and for a moment it felt like Lena was just ahead, waiting around the corner, carrying her basket still. That evening they sat on the porch. Amos had lit the lamp inside, but let the outside remain lit only by the soft spill of starlight and the occasional blink of lightning bugs hovering in the garden. Clara brought out a quilt and they shared it between their knees. From inside the house, a low ticking filled the pause between their breaths. The wall clock, faithful as always. I brought something, Clara said, reaching into her bag. She handed Amos a small journal, a new one, unmarked. For what? He asked. For your letters, she said softly. I know you still write them. Amos held the book in both hands, ran his thumb along the spine. He didn't answer right away, didn't need to. Finally, he looked up at her and said, Thank you, child. It was the way he had always called her, even after she turned 40. They sat that way a long time, watching the stars, listening to the insects sing their slow, steady lullabies, feeling the porch rock beneath them like a boat at anchor. Neither spoke much more. There was no need. Sometimes the most generous thing we can do for one another is to share the silence without asking it to perform. Later, when Clara had gone to bed, the guest room aired and made up days ago just in case, Amos returned to the porch once more. The night had grown cooler, the crickets quieter. He held the journal in his hands, opened it, and on the first page wrote, For Lena, and for the ones who come after, who listen and wait and walk the same old roads. He closed it, set it beside the lamp, and leaned back in the chair, listening once more to the world as it gently turned without sound or hurry. Morning came softly. The sky was veiled in a thin mist, as if the world hadn't fully made up its mind to be awake. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped its gentle rhythm against a hollow branch, and the wind, faint but certain, stirred the tops of the tall grass beyond the porch rail. Inside the house, Clara stirred in the guest room. Amos had been up for an hour already, moving with the kind of quiet that belonged to people used to early light and worn floorboards. He had fed the birds, watered the pots of mint and rosemary by the kitchen steps, and now stood by the stove, watching the kettle begin to hum its low morning tune. The familiar click of her door opening made him glance sideways. Clara padded barefoot across the floor, wrapped in one of the patchwork robes Lena had made years ago. Faded blues and soft flannels stitched with a steady hand. She offered him a sleepy smile, then leaned against the doorframe. You always get up so early. Amos handed her a mug. Not so much early as steady, he said. She sipped slowly, both hands wrapped around the ceramic. Smells like fall. He nodded, looking out the window where the leaves had begun to yellow at the edges. Means it's time for baking, he said, almost to himself. Clara's eyebrows lifted. She tilted her head in the way her mother used to when she was considering something quietly. What if we made her honey cornbread? She asked. Amos looked at her then, a long, still look. Not of surprise, but of gentle agreement. I reckon we should. They worked side by side in the kitchen, just as he and Lena once had. The light streamed through the east window, casting warm gold across the countertop. Clara tied her hair back with a cloth napkin and began gathering ingredients from the pantry. Flour, cornmeal, salt, baking soda. Amos opened the old wooden recipe box. his fingers brushing the soft edges of index cards whose corners had begun to curl like leaves in late September. He pulled out the one marked cornbread, honey, Lena's favorite, written in her careful, looping hand. Clara leaned over and smiled when she saw it. She even underlined, "Don't overmix." Amos chuckled. She meant it too. You'd think that batter was a living thing. They moved through the steps slowly, not from uncertainty, but from respect, measuring without rushing, stirring with wooden spoons that had passed through years of mornings like this. Butter softened in the sun near the back door. The oven clicked on and began to fill the room with its soft hum. While the cornbread baked, they washed bowls at the sink, each taking a side, working in quiet rhythm. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rattling the branches of the maple tree that shaded the porch. The scent of warm honey and browned cornmeal began to fill the house, mixing with the smell of old wood and soap in a way that could only be described as home. When the bread was ready, they cut 2 thick slices, buttered them, and carried their plates out to the porch. The sky had cleared now, blue, open, but softened at the edges like an old photograph. They sat, eating slowly, letting the food and the silence and the memory of the morning settle gently around them. Clara took a bite and closed her eyes. "It tastes like Saturdays when I was 10, she said. Amos nodded. "I think that's what Lena was always after." He paused, not just the taste, but the remembering. The rest of the day unfolded as days in the country do when no one insists on hurrying. They walked the back path toward the creek and sat on the moss-covered bench there, watching the water slide over smooth stones. They picked a few sprigs of goldenrod, and Clara tucked one behind her ear, the way she had done when she was little, running through the field in dresses her mother had sewn. In the afternoon, they read, Clara by the window with a book of poems, Amos in his chair with the paper, but mostly they just watched a light shift across the room. Dinner was simple, eggs and potatoes fried in butter, and a small jar of peach preserves opened just for the occasion. They didn't light the overhead lamps, only the small table lamp in the corner and 2 candles on the windowsill. The house glowed amber, like it was remembering too. Later that night, Clara sat cross-legged on the porch steps, looking out at the stars. Amos rocked slowly behind her, wrapped in a shawl that still faintly smelled of lavender. "Do you ever wish," Clara said quietly, "you'd left? Moved to the city?" Amos thought about it for a long moment. "No," he said, "but I do wish Lena could have seen how it's changed." Clara nodded. "I think she'd be proud of how you stayed." "I didn't know how to leave," he said. "Not after her. This house, it was still talking." They sat a while longer. A barn owl called from the distance. The wind rustled the trees, and a leaf dropped gently to the porch rail without ceremony. Amos looked down at his hands. "They're slower now," he said. "Don't do as much as they used to." Clara reached over and held one. "You still plant things," she said, "just different kinds." He didn't answer, but his hand remained in hers until the night had folded itself completely over the house. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed, Amos lingered in the kitchen. He wrote a short note on the back of an envelope. "Baked the bread today." She remembered the smell. The recipe still works. It all still works. He tucked it into the new journal Clara had given him, just behind the first page. Then he blew out the candles one by one, watching the smoke curl and fade into the still sweet air. He stepped outside one last time. The moon was rising, just a sliver, but bright enough to cast shadows on the gravel path. He looked out over the field to the place where the tall grass moved like water in the wind and let his eyes rest there. Nothing called to him. No memories pressed close, only the quiet sense that something good had been held and would be held again. He returned inside, closed the door behind him, and felt the house settle gently into its night. The morning she left came with the sound of geese overhead. Their calls echoed across the field long before the sun had touched the tops of the cottonwoods, and Amos stood at the edge of the porch, coffee in hand, watching their V-shaped flight disappear into the gray blue. The sky was clear but pale, the kind of blue that comes with the end of summer, when the world is still warm but no longer young. Behind him, the house stirred gently. Clara moved through the kitchen without hurry, the creak of a cabinet door, the soft clink of china, the kettle starting its song. It was a familiar kind of quiet, not silence, but presence, the kind of hush that holds what's being left unsaid. They ate together at the kitchen table, just as they had the day before, and the one before that. Eggs, toast, a sliver of the cornbread they'd made together, still soft, still sweet with honey. Neither spoke much, and that too was part of the goodbye. Outside the window, the light was slowly warming the yard. Dew steamed off the wooden railings. A squirrel danced along the fence line, its paws wet and shining. Clara wiped her hands on a cloth napkin, folded it slowly, and placed it beside her plate. "I packed a few slices for the road," she said, "in wax paper, just like she used to." Amos nodded. She always said it kept better that way. Clara looked at him, eyes soft but steady. She was right about a lot of things. He smiled faintly. That's the burden of marrying someone wise. They stood at the door a while, Clara holding her small bag, Amos resting a hand on the frame. The gravel driveway stretched out before them, a ribbon of old memory, leading away from the house but never quite leading out. The wind carried the faint smell of clover. A single leaf floated down from the elm tree and landed between them. "I'll be back before the frost," she said. He didn't question it, didn't press for a date, just nodded as if frost and time and return were all part of the same slow rhythm. She leaned forward, kissed his cheek, and he, in turn, rested his hand on her shoulder for just a moment longer than necessary. Then she stepped down onto the path, her boots crunching in the gravel, with the same sound Lena's had made all those years ago. Amos didn't watch the car drive away. He never did. He went back inside, the screen door closing behind him with its soft sigh. The kitchen still smelled faintly of butter and cinnamon. He poured himself another cup of coffee, though it had gone lukewarm, and carried it to the porch. The morning light was thicker now, more gold than gray. The wind had settled, leaving the world in that brief stillness between bird call and breeze. On the small side table by the rocking chair, he noticed something new, a folded piece of paper tucked just beneath the book he'd left there. He opened it, Clara's handwriting steady and round. "Uncle, thank you for the quiet, for the stories you don't need to speak, for the way you hold things, not tightly, but long enough that they matter. The world feels louder now, but your house still remembers how to be kind. See you soon." See. He folded the note slowly, placed it in the front of the new journal, then leaned back in the chair, his eyes resting on the horizon, where the field met the pale blue sky. That day passed in pieces, not hurried, not long, just enough. He swept the kitchen, folded the robe Clara had worn, returned it to the cedar chest where Lena's quilts lay. He made himself a sandwich, just tomato and a bit of salt, and ate it on the back steps with the sun warming the porch stones beneath his feet. The afternoon passed with the turning of pages, a bit of weeding, and the company of the bluebird that had taken to perching on the fence near the herb bed. Amos talked to it now and then, not much, just a few words to keep the silence shaped like a conversation. As the sun began to lower itself into the long western trees, Amos moved through the house again, lighting the lamp, closing one window but leaving another cracked to let the night in gently. He found the wax paper bundle on the counter. Clara had left 2 slices of the cornbread, wrapped just as Lena would have, neatly folded, tied with a thin twine string. He placed them in the bread box, but not before tearing a small corner from one and tasting it. Sweet, dense, a little crumbly at the edge. Still good, still warm with memory. He wrote a short note that night on a fresh page of the journal. September 18th. Clara left this morning, took the road slow. She remembered how to listen. The birds came back around noon. The wind hasn't settled yet, but the house seems to have, and so have I. He paused, then added, grateful for the quiet things, for what returns even after it leaves. Before bed, he sat once more on the porch, letting the dark rise around him like a tide that held no threat. The stars blinked above, steady and old. Somewhere in the field, a fox barked once, then silence. He looked out toward the gravel path, now lost in shadow, not waiting, not longing, just remembering that people come and go, but the porch stays, the wind returns, and the house with its soft wood and worn corners keeps every voice that's ever passed through its rooms, even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones. The rain returned on a Tuesday afternoon. It didn't announce itself with thunder, nor with dark skies that rolled in like warnings. Number. It arrived quietly, as if it had always meant to come back and was only waiting for the right kind of silence. Amos was out in the garden when he felt the first drop touch the back of his hand. He looked up. The sky was still mostly light, just tinged with a softness around the edges. A faded gray like the inside of an old linen drawer. Another drop, then another, then 1,000 more, falling with that gentle cadence that seemed to know the rhythm of a quiet life. He didn't rush inside. There was no reason to. The rain was warm. The ground beneath his boots gave a little as it drank, but held firm. He stood there for a moment, listening to the way the drops struck the leaves and rolled down their green faces, to the way the wind curled around the corners of the porch, to the way the land seemed to exhale. The world was always thirsty for rain, but Amos knew better than to call it thirst. It was more like longing, a longing to remember, and today it remembered. When he finally stepped inside, he left his boots by the back door and hung his flannel shirt on the peg just above Lena's old apron. The house was dim now, shadows softening the edges of chairs and corners, but he didn't light a lamp. He liked the way the rain touched everything in silence. The kettle had been warmed earlier, and so he made tea without words. A few leaves of lemon balm, a bit of honey, poured into the green-rimmed cup, its glaze crazed from years of use. He carried it to the front room and sat in his chair by the window, the cushion still faintly smelling of rosemary and dust. Outside, the rain ticked softly on the glass. Inside, time forgot to move forward. It was there, in that long afternoon hush, that Amos opened the journal again. But this time, he didn't write a note to Lena. He didn't mark the weather or what had bloomed or what the birds were doing. Instead, he sat with the pen resting between his fingers and for a while just listened to the rain, as if waiting for it to tell him what to say. And then, without much thought, he began. To whoever finds this. He stopped, not because he doubted the words, but because they surprised him. He had never written like this before, never imagined these pages might belong to more than memory. But today, with the rain settling the house into its bones, and Clara's visit still resting like a warm stone in his chest, something had shifted. To whoever finds this. Today it rained again. Not much, but enough. Enough to remind the porch how to speak, and the windows how to weep softly without sadness. I've written many things in these pages, most for Lena, some for myself. But today I thought I'd write for someone else. Just in case you come to this house one day and wonder what it held. Just in case you walk these halls and feel something still breathing in the wood. Let me tell you, it's not the wind. It's not the mice in the walls or the boards settling with the seasons. It's love. It's memory. It's the sound of a woman's hands folding linens and the echo of her laugh in the back room and the soft way she used to hum while waiting for the kettle. It's the rhythm of rain and the way quiet things return. He paused there, rested the pen, took a sip of tea, watched as a droplet traced a line down the window, carving a slow, steady path toward the wooden sill. He smiled, not from joy exactly, but from recognition. There are moments when the world feels known. This was one of them. Later, as the rain lightened into mist, he stepped back onto the porch. The boards beneath his feet were damp and smelled of earth and pine. He leaned on the railing, letting his fingers rest on the cool wood, and looked out over the field. The goldenrod was heavy with water, bowed in reverence. The path to the fence had turned to mud, and the robins had returned, plucking worms from softened soil. He stayed that way a long while, listening, not waiting for anything in particular, not hoping for a sign, just being. That, he'd come to learn, was enough. By dusk, the rain had stopped. The sky opened again, revealing a soft flush of peach and rose spreading low along the western tree line. Amos lit a lamp inside, then another, casting long amber lines across the kitchen floor. He warmed a bowl of soup, cut a slice of the last cornbread, and ate slowly by the window, watching the day dim into evening. Afterward, he returned to the journal. If you're reading this, I hope you know that a quiet life is not a lesser one. I hope you know that stillness is not emptiness. And I hope, more than anything, that you find your own porch, your own quiet corner of the world where the rain still speaks kindly and memory sits beside you like an old friend. He closed the book, blew out the lamp, and stood in the doorway one last time before bed. The moon had risen. A few clouds lingered, but the stars had returned in their quiet, faithful way. He placed a hand on the frame, felt the grain of the wood beneath his palm, thought of Lena, thought of Clara, thought of the letter he never knew he'd write until today. Then he stepped back inside, closed the door softly, and let the night settle around him like a blanket that had always known his shape. The morning came with a softness that felt more like memory than weather. There had been no wind overnight, and the trees stood still, not stiff, but resting as if the rain had hushed even the need to move. Amos woke slowly, no sudden start, no alarm, just a quiet sense that the house had finished sleeping and was ready, now, to begin the day. The first sound he noticed was not the kettle, nor the floorboards beneath his slippers, but the faintest tapping somewhere near the back of the house. Not urgent, not rhythmic, just the lightest brush, like a leaf nudging glass in a lazy breeze. He moved through the kitchen, mug in hand, and followed the sound to the back room. The one that had once been a pantry, then Lena's sewing room, and now, mostly a place where Son lived longest. The curtain was half drawn, and when he pulled it aside, he saw it, a nest, tucked neatly between the window casing and the wooden ledge just outside, delicate, assembled from twigs, dried grass, and some pale string that looked very much like the thread Lena once used to mend Amos's collars. And inside the nest, 3 eggs, pale blue, still, perfect. He didn't move for a while, didn't tap the glass, didn't try to peer closer, just stood, mug cooling in his hands, heart full of a quiet that didn't need explaining. There was a bird nearby, a mother surely, waiting in a branch above the window frame, her feathers puffed against the morning chill, watching him as one does an old neighbor who's known the land long enough not to interfere. He nodded to her, a small gesture, but it felt appropriate. A kind of mutual recognition between 2 creatures who understood what it meant to make something with care. Later that morning, he sat out on the back steps with a slice of leftover bread and a pat of butter melting in the warm air. The sun was climbing, but slowly, as if taking its time to dry what the rain had given. The yard smelled of wet leaves and stone, and the porch steps were damp in the corners where moss had taken hold. He watched a line of ants move along the railing, each carrying a burden small enough to miss but large enough to matter. Beyond the fence, the field was still, except for the occasional flutter of wings or the soft sway of taller grasses returning to their usual posture after the weight of the storm. He didn't do much that day, didn't mow the lawn, though it could have used it, didn't sweep the porch, though a few new leaves had blown in, didn't clean out the pantry, as he told himself he might. Instead, he wrote, not pages, not even full thoughts, just a few lines here and there, in the journal Clara had given him. A nest this morning, quiet and whole, 3 small eggs, still as prayer. And later, the world doesn't need noise to continue, it only needs time and space and kindness. In the afternoon, he returned to the back room. The nest was still there, unchanged, but the mother bird had settled in now, her small body tucked over the eggs, beak pointed forward, still a sculpture. Amos sat in the old sewing chair, the one Lena had always said was too hard for company, but just right for her own back. He remembered watching her here years ago in this very room, spools of thread balanced on the windowsill, her fingers working through fabric like they were solving a problem she never had to explain. She had once patched a boy's shirt from town, a stranger who came by with a hole in the elbow and too much pride to ask for help. She didn't charge him, just fixed it, sent him on his way, and said nothing more than, take care. That was her way, simple acts, held gently, let go. Amos stayed in the chair longer than he meant to, longer than he realized. The bird did not stir, the light did not move quickly, and the day passed without event, but not without meaning. He thought, not for the first time, about how much of life is made up of things we do not speak of. The birds who build in the eaves of old houses, the tea left warming on the stove, the letters never mailed, but written anyway. That evening, he cooked himself a simple supper, potatoes, a fried egg, a slice of tomato, a meal Lena would have called honest. He ate it at the kitchen table, watching the light change on the wooden walls as the sun slipped lower behind the trees. The house was quiet, but not lonely. There were sounds if you listened for them. The hum of evening insects stirring beyond the screens. The small shift of the bird on her nest as she settled deeper into the feathers. The soft knock of the spoon against the edge of his plate. It was enough, more than enough. Before sleep, he returned one last time to the journal. By lamplight, he wrote, "There's a nest at the back window. She built it without asking, but she's welcome to stay. Funny how a house becomes more than yours the longer you listen to what it wants to hold." That night, as Amos lay in bed, he imagined the eggs, small, whole, waiting, not rushed, not stirred, just there, in their place. He thought of Clara, of Lena, of the letter folded in the front of the journal, and the way the house now kept so many things he never meant to hold on to, but was grateful to still have. And as the wind moved softly through the leaves outside his window, he drifted into sleep. Not fast, not slow, but in the quiet way things do when they're exactly where they belong. The morning opened with the kind of light that made even old paint look gentle again. It wasn't a dramatic sunrise, no streaks of orange or purple, no grand unveiling over the horizon, just a soft brightness that slowly brushed its way across the windowsills and the tops of fence posts, like someone waking the world with a whisper. Amos sat on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees. For a moment, he didn't move, not from tiredness, but from a quiet kind of listening, as if waiting to hear what kind of day it wished to be. Out in the kitchen, he poured himself a cup of yesterday's coffee, still good enough when warmed gently on the stove. He didn't add anything to it, didn't need to. Some mornings he liked it bitter, as if the taste alone could call things into focus. Outside, the yard was drying, the soil still dark with moisture, but no longer clinging to his boots in heavy clumps. It was a sort of day meant for tending things, the quiet maintenance that came not from necessity, but from care. He pulled on his old hat, the one Clara had once tried to throw out before realizing it had become more memory than cloth, and stepped outside into the soft warmth of mid-morning. The garden had grown thick in the days since the rain, not wild, not unruly, just fuller. The beans had climbed halfway up the trellis, spiraling their way through the lattice with the quiet persistence of things that know how to wait. The tomatoes had set fruit, small green orbs hanging like promises underneath the leaves, and along the back edge, the weeds had returned, not spitefully, just as part of the deal. Amos fetched the hoe from its spot in the shed and began working along the fence line. Each swing was slow, measured, not meant to tear up the earth, but to coax it back into balance. The sun moved behind him, casting his shadow long across the tilled rows, and all the while, he thought about something Lena once said, years ago when they'd first started the garden together. "Not everything has to bloom to be worth keeping," she'd told him, kneeling beside a patch of herbs that never flowered, but always came back year after year. Amos hadn't understood it fully then. He'd nodded, of course. He was always quick to agree when Lena said things that sounded important, but only now, with years in his hands and the quiet around him, did he begin to feel the weight of it. There were plants in this garden that had never once offered a blossom. No bright petals, no fragrance, just leaves, soft or sturdy, shaped like hearts or narrow spears, and roots that held when the winds came. They weren't noticed by visitors, not asked for in bouquets, but they were part of the rhythm of things. He thought as he cut away a stubborn patch of crabgrass about people he'd known who were just the same, quiet in their growing, never flashy but always there when things needed tending. After a while, he took a break, sat on the edge of the raised bed where the lettuces were just beginning to fan out. He pulled off his gloves and wiped his brow with a handkerchief that still carried the faint smell of cedar from the drawer where he kept it. From his pocket, he drew out his notebook. Just a small thing with a few dog-eared pages left. He scribbled something quickly before the thought dissolved in the heat. The best parts of the garden don't ask for attention. They just keep growing, waiting for someone quiet enough to notice. In the distance, a red-winged blackbird called from the fence post, and beyond that, the gentle rustle of the fields. The sound wasn't sharp. It never was. It moved like a sigh through the taller grasses, reminding Amos that everything he heard now was once part of something that had lived through storms. The fence in the back corner was leaning again, not badly, but enough to need looking after. So Amos stood, gathered his tools, and walked slowly toward it. Repairing fence was never urgent work, not like calving season or a busted pipe. It was the sort of task that let your thoughts wander. As he hammered a new nail into the aged wood, he recalled a neighbor from long ago, Mr. Ellis, who used to walk his fields every evening not to check the crops, but just to greet the fences. "They've done more than most men to hold things together," Mr. Ellis once said, resting a hand on the top rail like it was an old friend. Amos had thought the man was half mad. Now, he wasn't so sure. When the repairs were finished, he stood back and looked at the fence. It wasn't straight, it wasn't new, but it held. And in that holding, it offered something like peace. He ran a hand along the top board, splinters brushing the pads of his fingers, and felt the way the wood had soaked up the sun. Warm, as if it remembered every season that had passed over it. Later that day, he boiled a few new potatoes, chopped some herbs, and ate a simple lunch by the open window. The bird's nest was still there, still, silent. He didn't need to check the eggs. He didn't need to know their timing. Some things just asked to be trusted. That evening, as twilight settled into the folds of the land, Amos sat on the front porch. The rocking chair creaked beneath him, wood shifting softly in time with his breath. The air was sweet with the scent of lilac and warm soil, and in the hush between bird song and cricket call, he thought again of Lena's words. Not everything has to bloom to be worth keeping. The thought settled into him like dew into grass, slow, invisible, but real. And as the first stars began to blink above the western trees, he closed his eyes and let the quiet take him. The postmark was smudged. It had come sometime during the night, slipped quietly into the mailbox by the hands of the same postal driver who had driven the route for years without ever disturbing the gravel more than he had to. Amos found it just after breakfast. The sun was already leaning into the yard, casting long shadows through the porch railings, and the cardinals had begun their late morning arguments in the oak tree out front. He hadn't expected any mail, and certainly not a letter handwritten in such a careful, looping script, the kind that reminded him of ledgers and hymnals and a time when people left more space between their words. The return address was from town, a street name Amos didn't recognize, probably a newer road, paved and curbed and given one of those polished names like Meadowview or Sycamore Lane. But the name on the envelope was one he did remember, Lawrence Timmons. It had been over 30 years since Amos last heard from him, not from any falling out or loud parting, but from that slow, natural drift that often happened when men grew older and followed the pull of different corners of the county. Lawrence had been one of those boys who always ran toward the horizon. Even as kids, he had a way of walking that made it look like he knew where the next road led, even if no one else had a map. They had gone to school together, shared a desk one winter when the stove in the back of the room broke, and the children huddled closer in the only warm spot by the south-facing window. And in the spring of their 17th year, they had planted a row of young maple trees along a stretch of red clay road just west of the river bend. No one had asked them to. It wasn't for school credit or part of a community project. They had done it because they'd found a bundle of saplings left behind after a clearing and felt it would be a shame to let them dry out and die. They planted them in silence mostly, digging out little bowls in the earth and tucking each tree in like a child. Lawrence said very little that day, except once. One day, someone might walk this road and feel like it's holding a little more shade than it used to. Amos opened the envelope slowly, careful not to tear the corners. The paper inside was a pale blue, lined neatly with creases that suggested it had been folded more than once before being mailed. The letter wasn't long, just a page and a half. Lawrence wrote simply, as if picking up from a conversation they'd only paused, not one that had been quiet for 3 decades. He was living near town now, his knees no longer strong enough for the uneven ground of the farm. He didn't mind it much, though he missed the quiet. And then, in the second paragraph, he wrote, I drove down the old Red Hill Road last Sunday. The maples we planted, they're still there. Taller than the telephone poles now, thick with green. You can't see the fence anymore. The trees have swallowed it whole. Thought of you. Amos set the letter down on the table, its weight small but noticeable. He sat still for a long while, listening to the rhythm of the house, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the occasional chirp of the birds on the feeder, and underneath all of it, a new presence, not loud, just steady, a row of trees tended by time. He hadn't thought about those saplings in years, not because they hadn't mattered, but because that spring had been folded into so many others. One season always leaned into the next, until memories blurred like the edge of a hill seen through summer heat. But now that Lawrence had said their names, called them up, they stood tall again in the back of his mind. Amos could remember the way the dirt smelled that day, how it clung to the cuffs of their pants and dried into russet rings. He remembered how Lawrence had whistled while tamping down the roots, a low tune that never quite found its melody, and how, as the sun dipped low, they'd stood at the edge of the field and looked back at the line they had made, thin sticks of green pointing upward like questions. He walked out back, past the garden and the tool shed, down the worn path that led to the small clearing by the stream, the same stream that ran dry most summers, but always returned when the rains came faithfully enough. There was a maple there too, not one of the planted ones, but one that had found its own way into the soil years ago. Amos sat beneath it, his back pressed to the trunk, and listened. It wasn't just the water or the breeze through the leaves. It was the sense that something had been remembered at the exact moment it needed to be. Not everything asks to be recalled. Some memories are content to rest until they're called gently, like a dog who knows the way home. He took out the letter again, folded carefully into his pocket, and read it one more time. Then he leaned back, looking up through the canopy to where the sunlight danced in small, slow-moving shapes. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like something had found its way into the quiet part of him that had been waiting. Not for rain, not for answers, but for just this. Amos didn't leave the house in a hurry. He never did, and even if he had wanted to, the old hinges on the back door creaked in such a way that reminded him to take his time. He packed a sandwich, just one slice of ham between two thick-cut pieces of bread, and wrapped it in the kind of waxed paper he still kept rolled in a drawer, torn carefully along the metal edge like his mother used to do. Beside the sandwich, he tucked in a small apple and a canteen of water, still cold from the well house. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough for the kind of visit he had in mind. The road was farther now than it had seemed back then. Or perhaps it was just the way age stretches the horizon, so that what was once a quick afternoon walk now asked for a little more care, a little more patience with the knees and the hips that had grown less eager to hurry. But Amos didn't mind the distance. He left just after the rooster's second crow, when the dew was still thick on the tops of the grass, and the sunlight slanted sideways through the tall walnut trees that lined the eastern side of the property. The path to Red Hill Road wasn't much of a path at all anymore. Just a fading pair of wheel ruts through the back pasture and a gap in the fence where the boards had long since fallen down and no one had bothered to mend them. Amos walked slowly, his boots pressing softly into the moist earth as he made his way toward a morning that felt both new and deeply familiar. The air was gentle, touched with the scent of clover and warmed stone. Insects rose in lazy spirals from the edges of the fields, and somewhere in the near distance, a cow lowed with the long stretching voice of a creature who had just remembered how good it felt to be alive. He reached the road by mid-morning. It looked different, of course. More gravel had been added over the years, flattened by trucks and tractors in the quiet business of living things. But it was still, unmistakably, that road. The same bend in the earth, the same slow rise of the hill that led to the first turn where he and Lawrence had started digging holes with shovels borrowed from the schoolhouse tool shed. And there, standing taller than he could have imagined, was the first of the maples. Its trunk had thickened into something solid and noble, a tree that had known storms and droughts and the gentle hands of wind turning its leaves like pages in a book. Amos stopped walking. He didn't say anything, didn't feel the need. He just stood there, hat in hand, and looked at the tree for a long time. He moved along the row, slowly, like a man visiting old friends. Each tree had its own shape now. Some leaned a little, their growth curved by the light or the nearby hedgerow. Some had stronger roots, anchored firm even where the earth sloped gently downward toward the creek that still trickled at the edge of the road. He remembered how small they had once been, just slips of green, barely up to their knees. He and Lawrence had guessed at the spacing, choosing the spots by feel rather than measurement, letting the rhythm of their digging determine the distance. Now the trees stood like sentinels, quiet and certain, guarding a memory that no one else would notice unless they had been there, with their hands in the soil. Halfway down the row, Amos sat. There was a flat stone near the base of one of the trees, a good stone, the kind that welcomed tired knees and old backs without complaint. He unwrapped his sandwich, took a slow bite, and let the sounds of the road settle around him. A bird hopped from branch to branch overhead, its wings making soft chuffing sounds with each short flight. The breeze rustled through the leaves with the easy breath of late summer. Nothing urgent, nothing waiting, just a road, a line of trees, and a man who had once planted them without knowing what he was really planting. He thought about writing back to Lawrence, maybe even sending a photograph, though Amos didn't own a camera and wouldn't have known where to develop the film anyway. But then again, some things didn't need pictures. Some things were better left in the quiet exchange between two people who understood what it meant to care for something long after it had forgotten your name. He took a small knife from his pocket, began to whittle at the twig that had broken off in the wind. Not to carve anything in particular, but just to feel the steady rhythm of the blade working through the wood. That was something he had missed. Not the product, but the process. The quiet time between intention and outcome, when your hands knew what to do and the world didn't demand anything else from you. By early afternoon, the sun had crept high enough to cast speckled light through the maples, painting the gravel with shifting spots of gold. Amos stood again, tucking the apple core into a small pocket in his bag to carry back with him. He brushed off his pants, tipped his hat toward the trees in a small, wordless farewell, and turned back toward home. The wind came behind him, light and warm, as if to say, "You remembered," and that was enough. Amos reached the pasture gate just as the first drops fell. Not the sudden kind of rain that rushes down with noise and thunder, but a softer kind. The kind that introduces itself first with a single touch on the back of your hand, as if asking permission to come closer. He paused, his fingers resting on the top rung of the gate, and looked up into the sky that had been quiet all morning. There, above the fields, the clouds had gathered themselves into a soft gray quilt, stitched loosely across the blue, ready to release whatever they had held. And now, gently, they were letting go. He didn't rush toward the house. There was no need. The rain was light enough that it felt more like memory than water. Each drop a gentle echo of storms that had passed, of gardens planted, of tin roofs and lullabies and the hush that came after long, hot days. The soil beneath his boots grew darker with each step, its thirst being met without demand, without drama, just a slow drink from a sky that had finally remembered its promise. By the time Amos stepped onto the porch, his shoulders were damp, his hat brim heavy with water. He set the satchel down beside the old bench and stood for a while facing the yard, watching as the drops tapped against the leaves with that quiet urgency that only the earth could understand. The garden seemed to sigh under the rain, not in relief exactly, but in recognition, as if to say, "Ah, you've come home too." Inside, he hung his hat on the nail by the door and placed his boots on the mat Lena had braided from strips of old shirts and feed sacks. He boiled water for tea, the chamomile blend he rarely drank except on rainy days, when the scent reminded him of her calm hands and the way she used to cup her mug close as if drawing heat into her chest on days when her thoughts had wandered far. With his cup in hand, Amos sat by the window, the one facing west, where he could see the field and the soft curve of the road he had just returned from. The rain had grown steadier now, but not heavier. It came down like someone reading aloud from a slow, familiar story, one he had heard before, but never tired of. On the sill, a tiny trail of water gathered to the edge of the frame and slipped downward, marking the pane with a wavering silver thread, and he smiled, not from joy exactly, but from recognition. This was the kind of moment he didn't plan for, but received like a letter in a kind hand. He sat for a long time, watching. The bees had retreated, the songbirds gone quiet, and only the soft knock of the rain filled the room now. He thought again about the letter from Lawrence, folded neatly on the kitchen table behind him, about the trees, about the way things grow even when forgotten, and about how rain always returns, not on our schedule, but on its own, at a time that feels both late and right. By mid-afternoon, the light outside had dimmed into that tender, blue-gray wash that only happens when the rain has claimed the day without apology. Amos lit the oil lamp early, not because he needed it yet, but because it felt like the kind of afternoon that asked for a soft flame. The lamp hissed once as the match touched the wick, then settled into its quiet glow, and the rooms, simple, wooden, lined with shelves and worn things, seemed to breathe deeper in the golden light. He took up his notebook and turned to a fresh page. The ink flowed slowly, and his hand moved with the unhurried rhythm of someone who is no longer writing to remember, but writing to honor. On the page, he wrote, "The rain didn't come quickly, nor with fanfare, but it came just the same. A guest who knew we'd still be here waiting." He set the pen down, closed the cover, and leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking softly like a cat stretching in its sleep. Outside, the gutter along the edge of the roof had begun to overflow in places, and the rain fell in thicker drops, leaving round splashes on the stone path. A frog, or maybe two, had begun to call from the ditch beyond the garden, and further off, beyond what he could see, the land drank in the rain with gratitude that needed no words. Amos closed his eyes, not to sleep, not yet, just to rest, to listen, to be with the rain as it played its small, soft song on the roof, on the trees, on the years. And for the first time in what felt like a long while, he did not wonder if the rain would come again. It had returned like a friend, like a prayer answered not with thunder, but with kindness. Evening came as it always did, without fanfare, without permission, just a slow folding of light into the edges of things. Amos had not moved much since the rain had started. After his tea, he had set the cup in the sink and walked slowly from room to room, not to clean or arrange or tend, but to witness. The rain had brought with it a kind of hush, not emptiness, but fullness made gentle. The house felt more alive when the world outside grew quiet. In the back room, the one with the old braided rug and the bookshelf of farm journals and faded paperbacks, Amos stood by the window watching the evening gather. The rain had eased into mist now, barely touching the leaves as it drifted down, as if the sky itself was exhaling slowly, finally allowed to rest. He left the window open a crack, just enough to let the smell in, that earthy, blessed scent of wet soil and stone and leaf, carried gently on the kind of breeze that found its way through cracked screens and spaces beneath doors. He breathed it in as if it might remind his body how to feel something he hadn't remembered he'd forgotten. The floor creaked softly underfoot as he crossed back into the kitchen, lit only by the small lamp on the table. Its glow held inside a glass shade tinted the color of butter. He reached for the bread box and took out the last piece of Lena's molasses loaf from the batch he'd thawed last week. It was dense, sweet, and crumbled slightly at the edges as he sliced it. He toasted it over the wood stove, not to cook it really, but to warm it, to coax its scent back to life. When it was ready, he spread a little butter on top and ate it slowly, standing by the stove while the fire inside crackled low and sure. Outside, the world was darkening. The porch, slick from the rain, shone in the lamplight like a river's skin gathering glimmers of orange and gold in the puddles between the boards. He stepped out into it, wearing the soft cardigan that Lena had knit sometime around the last leap year. He couldn't remember which. The wool was thin at the elbows, but it held its warmth the way old arms do, not fiercely, but faithfully. The sounds of the night had begun their shift. The frogs, having waited their turn all through the wet afternoon, now filled the air with their hollow songs. A choir of little voices echoing from the ditch in the pond near the edge of the woods. Crickets joined in next, their rhythms precise and unbothered, filling the spaces between drops with something that sounded like patience made musical. And from the tall grass, there came the occasional rustle of some small creature going about its evening with quiet purpose. Amos sat in the porch rocker, a blanket folded over his lap, and listened, not as one waiting for something to happen, but as one content to hear the world speak in its own way. The stars came out slow, as if unsure whether the clouds had truly left, but by the time he looked up, the sky was clearing, a soft scattering of silver on a canvas still carrying the memory of rain. The moon had not yet risen, but its promise was felt in the cool blue edge of everything. He thought for a moment of how Lena used to name the stars, not the ones with charts and legends, but the ones she made up, calling them after people in the town or naming them for things she loved and missed. "That one," she had said once, pointing near the barn roof, "looks like my grandmother's apron string when the wind caught it just right." And he had laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was her. The porch swing creaked as the wind moved it gently, a sound so familiar he didn't even hear it until it stopped. And when it did, he noticed how deep the stillness could be. The kind that folded around you like an old quilt, stitched together by years you hadn't counted until now. He pulled the blanket higher on his lap, tilted his head back, and let his eyes rest on the sky. There was no story to tell in that moment, no grand thought, just air and sound, and the soft weight of night settling over everything that had waited. Behind him, the lamp inside the house flickered slightly as the breeze found its way through the cracks. The curtain near the window moved like a hand waving slowly, not in goodbye, but in comfort. Amos let his eyes drift closed, not fully asleep, not quite awake. He floated in that small, precious space between awareness and dream, where everything was slower and softer and kinder. The porch boards beneath his feet were warm still from the day, and the night pressed close around him like a friend. And just before his thoughts dissolved into whatever came next, he whispered something he didn't realize he still knew. "Thank you for coming back." Amos woke before the sun, though the sky was already beginning its quiet shift from blue-gray to a pale watered gold. There was no alarm, no sound but the soft creak of the house settling into morning. He lay there for a moment, still wrapped in the remnants of sleep, as if the night had not quite let go of him yet. Then, slowly, he sat up, his body adjusting in pieces. The knees, the back, the hands that always reached first for the wool sweater folded over the chair. The air was cooler, not cold, but touched by something fresh and washed. And the silence, it wasn't empty, it was filled, with the sound of damp earth breathing in again, with the whisper of leaves still dripping from the night before. He moved through the house with practiced softness, a hand on the doorframe, a shoulder brushing past the hanging coat. He did not need to turn on the light. The rooms knew him, and he, them. In the kitchen, he set the kettle to boil. Its small click on the stovetop marked the first sound of intention in a world that had, until now, simply been being. While the water warmed, he stood at the window, hands resting on the sink's edge, and looked out across the fields. The glass was still speckled with the soft fingerprints of the storm, little tracks of rain curving downward like veins. Beyond the porch, the ground shimmered with quiet puddles, catching the new light like tiny mirrors for the sky. The birds returned first, not in flocks, not in a sudden burst, but as individuals, cautious at first, then bold with each passing note. A robin, its chest bright against the damp wood, pecked carefully at the base of the fence post. Further out, a pair of doves cooed low from the branches of the pecan tree, their rhythm unbothered, as if the rain had been expected. Amos watched them without moving. He loved mornings like this, the ones that began not with decisions, but with noticing. There was nothing he needed to do that could not wait, no call to urgency, no hurry in his limbs, just the small, ordinary truth of being awake in a world that had just been watered. When the kettle began to hum, he poured the water slowly over the dark leaves in the old brown pot. Steam rose in a thin curl and drifted upward, joining the gentle mist still hovering at the window ledge. He brought the cup with him to the porch and settled once more into the rocker that had greeted so many mornings before. The wood was cool beneath him, the cushion slightly damp at the edges, but none of it mattered. He was here, and so was the rain, not falling now, but present in everything. Across the yard, the garden had changed. He could see it even from here. The tomatoes, weighed down by last night's gift, leaned slightly forward, like heads bowed in prayer. The beans climbed higher than they had the day before, reaching eagerly toward a sky now clearing itself with steady blue. Even the weeds, unwelcome but familiar, looked greener, healthier somehow. Amos would tend to them later, not with resentment, but with the same care he offered the things he meant to grow. After all, everything that survived the drought deserved a second look. A breeze passed through then, cool and dry, carrying with it the scent of old leaves, wet bark, and something that always reminded him of his father's boots, that worn leather and rain kind of smell that clung long after a storm. He closed his eyes briefly, let the wind move across his face without resistance. It was the kind of moment that could have slipped by unnoticed, but Amos noticed, and that made all the difference. He spent the rest of the morning in slow movements. He walked the garden paths with hands behind his back, nudging small stones aside with the toe of his boot, checking leaves for beetles and noting which rows needed a little extra compost. He picked a few early cucumbers, wiped the rain from their skins, and placed them gently into the bowl Lena used to keep by the sink. In the shed, he ran his fingers along the handles of tools worn smooth from years of planting, digging, turning. He didn't lift them, not yet. There would be time. For now, it was enough to greet them again. By mid-morning, the sun had broken fully through the cloud cover, spilling warmth onto the porch in long golden strips. The birds had grown bolder, their songs stretching upward into the clean air, and Amos, sitting once again with his tea, noted how even the silence between the chirps had its own kind of music. He wasn't thinking about the drought anymore, not really. He knew it wasn't over. One rain didn't change the season, but it had broken something open, some quiet chamber of waiting that had grown too tight in his chest, and now there was space again, space for breath, for seeds, for the slow, blessed return of rhythm. Later that day, perhaps, he would write again, to Lawrence, or not, maybe just to the page. He didn't know yet, For now, he would let the day unfold in its own time, as the earth always had, patient, watchful, trusting that even dry fields remember the rain. The evening came not like a door closing, but like a hand slowly brushing the light from the tops of the trees. It was the kind of dusk that settled in layers, first across the fields, then the hedgerows, and finally on the porch rail where Amos sat, his fingers curled around a warm mug of barley tea. The rain had passed, but its touch remained in the scent of the grass, the hush of the road, and the way the wind moved like someone walking barefoot through a familiar room. He had spent the afternoon doing very little, a slow walk to the barn, a quiet hour folding old feed sacks and stacking kindling just so, not because it needed to be done, but because his hands had remembered the rhythm of it. He had sliced an apple, eaten it by the sink, and then listened, really listened, to the sounds of the day catching its breath after the long dry spell. There was something sacred about doing nothing when the world no longer demanded movement, and so as the light softened, he returned to the porch, to the rocker that had held him through all seasons. It welcomed him again without question. Across the pasture, the sun dipped low behind the ridge, its light brushing the hilltops in long, lazy strokes of honey and smoke. The trees stood still, as if not wanting to interrupt the moment. Their leaves, still heavy from the night before, caught the last rays and turned them into glints of gold just shy of fire. It reminded Amos of evenings with Lena when she would hum without thinking. Not a song, really, but something between a tune and a memory. Sometimes she'd sit with her knitting and look up only when he spoke. Other times they wouldn't speak at all, not from distance but from fullness, from the quiet knowing that nothing needed to be added to what already was. He thought of her now without the ache that had once come so sharply. Grief had softened over time, like the worn edge of a spade used year after year to turn the same patient soil. There were still moments when her absence startled him, in the gap of a conversation or the way the light fell on her favorite chair. But more often now she was part of the silence, woven into it like the scent of lavender in a drawer long closed. Amos reached for the old journal he kept near the door. Not to write, but to hold, to feel the weight of it. Its spine was cracked, its corners turned in. The pages inside carried his handwriting in waves, some steady, some trembling, some trailing off mid-thought. He flipped to no page in particular, let his fingers settle where they would. On the left side, a short line caught his eye. The world speaks softest after the rain. He traced it with his thumb, smiled, and closed the book. There was nothing more to add. A whip-poor-will called from somewhere beyond the creek. Then another, and another. Their cries rose like threads in a quilt stitched by sound, binding the woods to the field, the porch to the dusk. Amos listened with the kind of attention you give to something you know won't last long, and yet, somehow, it always returned. The air cooled as the sun slipped fully from view. A thin mist began to rise from the low parts of the land, the moisture released now from its sleep in the soil. He could see it curling at the base of the old fence posts, climbing gently as if trying to remember what it was like to be cloud. And the crickets, steady and sure, played their nightly tune, unrushed, as though the whole world were learning how to rest again. Amos rocked slowly, the motion subtle, like a breath drawn inward and let go without sound. His body, tired but untroubled, found its own rhythm, not the rhythm of work, nor of memory, but the simple rhythm of being. He reached for the folded quilt at the foot of the chair, spread it across his lap, and felt the first stirrings of sleep begin to tug at the corners of his mind. But he did not rise. Not yet. There was more of the evening to hold. The stars began to appear one by one, as if shy at first, then braver with each passing moment. They came not to dazzle, but to accompany, to keep watch. The old oak near the gate stood dark against the sky, its branches a silhouette of something timeless, and Amos, wrapped in quiet and warmth, felt himself dissolve into the stillness of it all. There was no need for words, not now, not here. Just the soft echo of rain still hidden in the roots of things, and the steady beat of a man's heart at peace with waiting. The last of summer's green had begun to thin at the edges, and a gentle crispness crept to the wind that curled along the porches and down the narrow road through the valley. September was settling in, not with great fanfare, but with the quiet authority of something long awaited, and in the heart of that soft arrival was Ellis, the man who waited for rain, moving through the rhythms of his days as though they were stitched into the seams of the land itself. Each morning now, the porch bore a touch of dew, and the wooden planks were cool beneath Ellis's slippers. The air held that in-between stillness, the kind that carries no urgency, but invites the soul to listen, to pause, to breathe. He would bring his coffee out slowly, wrapped in that old green cardigan that seemed to remember his shape better than he did. He'd pause at the screen door before stepping into the morning, feeling its breath before his own. Beyond the porch, the fields had turned a deeper gold. The tall grasses leaned just slightly in one direction, as if bowing to the hush of the coming season. And far off, the sycamores along the creek edge were beginning to show their first glimmers of bronze. He took his seat as always, same wooden rocker, same slight groan beneath his weight, same soft exhale as he settled in. There were no urgent tasks that morning, no callers expected, no harvest that couldn't wait one more day. There was only the porch, the coffee, and the light which arrived through the haze like a whisper, not a shout. And there was silence, not the kind that aches with absence, but the kind that holds, the kind that tucks around you like a quilt in the early hours, woven from birdsong, the creak of wood, and the distant lowing of cattle down by Mr. Judson's pasture. The kind of silence that only grows in places where people still keep company with the earth. He'd sit that way for an hour or more, sipping slowly, occasionally rubbing a thumb along the lip of the ceramic mug Clara had made back when the kids were small. A little chip on the handle reminded him of a dropped moment, maybe when she'd shooed a curious cat from the counter or laughed too hard at something he said. Funny, how even a chip could feel like affection after enough years had passed. That morning, a letter had come, the kind with handwriting, a kind that had become rare in recent decades. It came from Isaac, their son, who now lived 2 states away and spoke in emails more often than envelopes. Ellis had waited to open it until the light turned from mist to gold, as if letters should be read only when the world is warm enough to receive them. Inside was a picture, printed from a phone but still soft at the edges, a picture of Isaac's daughter, Ellie, on her first day of school. She stood with a backpack far too large for her small shoulders, waving with the sort of giddy hope that childhood never second guesses. Ellis smiled long and slow. He set the photo beside his coffee and stared at it for a long time, not thinking so much as remembering Isaac, a boy with a similar look in his eyes, mischief wrapped in trust, both things he'd inherited from his mother more than from Ellis. Below the photo were a few lines in his son's hand. Thought you'd want to see her on her big day. We told her you used to wait for the school bus on the porch too. She said, "Tell Grandpa I hope it rains for him soon." Ellis blinked once, then again. He ran a slow finger beneath the words as though tracing the curve of a face not there. Somewhere in the back of his throat, something gathered, but he didn't let it fall. Instead, he folded the letter gently, slid it into the book he'd been reading, the Book of Still Mornings, and rested both beside the rocker, letting the warmth settle into him like an ember pressed into old wool. He stayed like that long past the steam left his mug. He watched the sun climb above the ridge, watched a squirrel scurry along the fence post with the determined panic of autumn gathering. He watched it all and offered no commentary, and slowly the air shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no great gust, no darkening of skies, just the smallest change, like the air had taken a breath, a softness, a scent not unlike petrichor, though no rain had fallen. Ellis stood. It was something in the bones, he always said, that he could feel weather the way the old barn did, by creaking a little more before storms. He walked the gentle slope down to the cedar tree at the edge of the property. It stood taller than anything else nearby, its bark gray and fragrant, its base thick with needles and clover. Clara used to sit there years ago with a basket of mending and a thermos of tea. He laid a hand on the tree's rough skin and leaned against it, letting its rootedness steady him. Then, slowly, he looked skyward, and there it was. Not rain, not yet, but the kind of cloud that knew how to remember. A single, low-hanging stretch of gray, wandering slow across the blue. The kind of cloud that doesn't announce itself, but keeps its promises. Ellis smiled and turned back toward the house, not in haste, but with that quiet hope that lives best in those who've waited a long time, not for storms, but for something far gentler, for the kind of rain that doesn't come to change things, but to remind us they're still there. That night, Ellis had slept with the window cracked open just a touch. It was something he hadn't done in months, not since the drought began and the air felt dry enough to crumble if touched too firmly. But now there was moisture again in the night's breath, a dampness that softened the edge of the breeze and carried with it the sound of distant tree frogs, as if some hidden choir beneath the leaves had resumed a hymn they'd paused long ago. He woke to that quiet, not quite silence, the kind that comes just before dawn when even the wind holds its breath and the first birds are only beginning to clear their throats in song. He didn't rise immediately. Instead, he lay there, watching the faint blur of morning spread across the ceiling beams in slow golden strokes. For a long time, he simply let the weight of the quilt hold him, not like a burden, but like a memory with warmth still inside it. When he finally sat up, the air felt different, not in any dramatic way, but as if the house itself had taken a deep, restful breath during the night and now stood straighter because of it. He made his way to the kitchen with the ease of one who knows every creak in the floorboards like the notes of a familiar song. The kettle sang, the toast browned just enough, and he took his coffee in the chipped enamel mug he always favored, on days when the sky looked thoughtful. Outside, the world was still wet with remembrance, not from new rain, but from that soft mist that draped itself across the land like a worn shawl over familiar shoulders. The fence posts glistened, beads of water forming tiny orbs of light where spiders had spun through the night. The leaves, brushed gently by the breeze, shimmered with a tired kind of joy, and Ellis, rocking on the porch with his coffee nestled between two hands, felt the stirring of something both old and new. Later that morning, he went to the shed, not because anything in particular needed doing, not yet, but because his fingers were itching to hold something wooden and well used. Inside, it smelled of cedar and old iron, dust and oil. Sunlight caught in the cracks of the walls. He ran his hand along the row of tools, letting his palm remember each grip, each notch made from years of steady work. And then, almost without thinking, he reached for the seed tin. It had sat there, unopened, since the first weeks of spring. There had been no reason to sow, no promise in the sky, no softness in the ground. But now, as his fingers brushed over the worn metal lid, he felt that familiar weight, not just of the seeds themselves, but of possibility. He opened it slowly. Inside, neat paper packets, some fading at the corners, their labels handwritten in Clara's looping script. Beans, sunflowers, zinnias, lettuce, and at the very bottom, tucked between two envelopes, a folded scrap of lined paper, yellowed, fragile, but still intact. He didn't recognize it at first, but as he unfolded it, his breath caught, not with surprise, but with the gentle ache of remembering. It was Clara's handwriting, but this was no label. It was a list titled, "Things We'll Plant When It Rains Again." Beneath it, corn because it sings in the wind, tomatoes because they taste like August, marigolds because they keep the rabbits out, dill for pickling if I ever get the jars down, hope because why not? Ellis smiled, the kind of smile that carries both laughter and longing. He folded the list back slowly, placed it atop the packets, and carried the tin out into the light. The soil in the side garden was still dark from the week's moisture. It had softened, opened up, no longer the brittle, cracking earth he'd known all summer. He knelt carefully, his knees stiff but willing, ran a hand through the dirt, felt its give, its warmth, and then, slowly, reverently, he began to press seeds into the ground. Not all of them, just a few, enough to mark the beginning of something more than just a season. He planted the zinnias first. Clara had always loved their cheer, the way they stood like little fireworks in the late summer beds. Then the beans near the trellis, their curling vines eager for something to hold on to. He worked in silence, save for the breath of the wind and the occasional creak of the garden gate swinging behind him. By midday, he sat again on the porch, hands streaked with soil, shirt damp at the collar. Before him, a few neat rows of new earth, barely different to anyone passing by, but to him, a promise. The sun had come out fully now, not hot, but kind, the kind of sun that doesn't hurry the day but warms it slowly from the edges. A bluebird landed briefly on the porch railing, tilted its head as if in conversation, then flew off toward the sycamores. Ellis raised his mug in its direction as if toasting something that didn't need to be spoken aloud, and somewhere, deep beneath the turned soil, the seeds rested, not waking yet, but dreaming of rain, of roots, of sky, and Ellis, the man who had waited so long, no longer waited in silence. He waited in motion, in intention, in faith that what is planted with gentleness returns in kind. By the time the sun had swung low behind the ridge, Ellis had returned to the porch with a yellow notepad and the fountain pen Clara had once given him. Back when writing letters was still the way people stayed close. He hadn't planned to write, but the quiet had a way of asking. The day had moved gently like a breeze through high wheat, and now, in the golden hush of late afternoon, his hands felt ready, not to work, but to share. So he set the pad across his knees, unscrewed the cap, and let the ink find its way. Dear Ellie, I got your picture, and your wave made it all the way here. You looked very ready for school, like your backpack held not only books, but maybe a few secret plans too. That's a good way to carry yourself into the world. I sat with your photo for a long while. It reminded me of your dad when he was small, especially the way your smile seems like it's hiding a question. Your dad used to ask the best ones. He paused here, watching the shadows grow longer in the grass. The garden rows looked like quiet sentences punctuated by the neat mounds of earth. He resumed, "You'll be glad to know I planted something today. Not because I had to, but because the ground felt ready again. The earth can be like a friend that goes silent for a while, but when it starts speaking again, you learn to listen differently. I planted zinnias, like your grandma used to love. They haven't bloomed yet, of course. Seeds don't hurry. But it felt right, pressing them into the soil, like I was saying hello to something old and kind. You asked your dad to tell me you hoped it would rain for me soon. Well, it did. And it was the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't shout or make a fuss. It came like a memory you don't realize you've been holding on to." He set the pen down for a moment and reached for the jar of pickled peaches he'd opened the night before. They were a little too sweet, but Clara always said that peaches were allowed to be dramatic. He spooned one onto a plate and took small bites between sentences. "The birds have come back to the cedar tree out front. You'd like them. There's one with feathers the color of your hair, soft and warm like cinnamon toast. It sang this morning like it had waited all season for the right note. The fence still leans where the ground swelled last spring, and the barn door creaks the same way it always has. Some things don't fix themselves, but they keep going anyway. I think that's their way of saying they're still in it with you. I hope your days are full of small good things, a pencil that sharpens just right, a lunchbox that smells like strawberries, a window seat with just the right light for reading. And if one of your classmates seems lonely, offer them part of your sandwich. You don't have to say anything special. Sometimes sharing your lunch is its own kind of poem." The page had begun to fill, but Ellis didn't rush the end. Essier listened as a few cicadas began to rasp in the distance, their songs folding into the dusk like distant fiddles. He wrote, "It's getting dark now and the porch lamp just clicked on. I think I'll sit here a while longer, maybe listen to the garden grow. You don't have to worry about me waiting anymore. The rain came and the ground remembered how to be soft, and that's more than enough for me these days. Love, Grandpa Ellis." He folded the letter carefully, slipped it into the envelope he'd prepared earlier, and sealed it with the practiced press of his palm. Tomorrow, he'd walk it down to the mailbox, that red-flagged sentry at the edge of the gravel drive, and let the wind carry it the rest of the way. Tonight, though, he sat on the porch as the first stars blinked through the haze, holding the warmth of the letter in his chest like an ember carried from one fire to the next. The night deepened, the air grew still, and Ellis leaned back in his chair, his hands resting gently over his heart, as though holding something planted there, now beginning to grow. The next morning, Ellis woke to the sound he had known all his life, but hadn't heard in many long months. Rain, software, steady, not storming, not rushing, but falling in that slow, assured rhythm that feels like someone whispering, "You can rest now." It pattered on the roof like fingers drumming a lullaby, ran down the eaves in quiet rivers, and made music in the tin gutters he'd meant to fix come spring. but had somehow grown fond of just as they were. He didn't rise immediately. There was no need. The world was doing the talking today. So he stayed beneath the quilt for a while, watching the window pane bead with droplets. The view outside blurred into a watercolor of browns, greens, and soft gray sky. He thought of Clara, how she used to hum when it rained, how she claimed she dreamed better on wet mornings than on dry ones. She said dreams move easier through mist. He mumbled to no one in particular, and smiled to himself because the room felt like it remembered her too. Eventually, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet finding the worn slippers with the precision of habit rather than sight. He moved slowly, but not because of age. It was the kind of slowness one gives to sacred things, like unfolding a love letter or planting a seed with your bare hands. He made his way to the kitchen, the smell of rain sneaking in ahead of him like a child home from school. He didn't boil water right away. Instead, he stood by the back door, looking out across the field, and simply watched the land receive the rain. The rows of zinnias, still no taller than his thumb, seemed to lift their heads in tiny gratitude. The beans with their tentative vines curled just slightly more forward, as if eager to climb toward something they couldn't yet name. And the soil looked alive, not in the way of bustling cities or noisy triumphs, but in the quiet, humble way of something being made whole again without asking for applause. He brewed coffee with gentle hands, letting the aroma fill the small house like a memory that knew the walls by heart. He brought his cup to the porch, stepping out into the damp morning with no intention but to sit. And so he did. The rain dripped steadily from the roof edge. It pooled at the porch steps and formed tiny streams along the path toward the garden. He rocked in his chair with the rhythm of an old hymn, his hands wrapped around the warm rug, his breath slowing to meet the hush of the world. There were no thoughts of chores, no errands or tasks, no need to wait anymore. He wasn't waiting, he was in it, in the very thing he had once longed for, not as a destination, but as a companion. The rain wasn't an answer, it wasn't a conclusion, it was simply here, like an old friend who doesn't knock, but steps in quietly, hangs their coat and sits down beside you without asking for explanation. He thought of Ellie and the letter he'd sent. He hoped she'd feel something of this when she read his words. Not the rain itself, but what it meant, that things come back, that seasons soften, that the heart, even when quiet for a long time, still knows how to open when the moment is gentle enough. As the hours passed, he stayed on the porch, watching the valley turn green again, not in grand sweeps, but in tiny promises. The fence posts glistened, the cedar tree swayed softly, its needles catching rain like prayers. A cardinal landed on the railing, sang a few slow notes, then flew away, leaving behind the stillness even richer than before. By late afternoon, the rain slowed. The clouds lifted their hem, revealing slivers of blue like lace behind an old curtain, and Ellis stood, his legs a little stiff, but his spirit light in the way of those who finally let go of waiting. He walked down the steps along the garden row and knelt again beside the first patch of zinnias. No bloom yet, but no need. His hand brushed the soil, dark and full. He closed his eyes, listened. The earth didn't speak aloud, but it held him, as it always had, as it always would. That evening he sat once more beneath the porch light, a blanket over his knees, a book resting unopened in his lap. He didn't need stories tonight. He was living in one, and the rain, somewhere beyond the ridge, kept falling, softly, faithfully, like love that never left, only waited for silence to be welcomed home. And so, dear friend, as the rain falls gently somewhere far off, may your breath slow, your thoughts grow quiet, and your heart find peace in the stillness of this moment. You've walked with us through memory and soil, through waiting and letting go. And now, it's time to rest. Let the hush of the night carry you, like a soft blanket pulled over tired shoulders. You are safe. You are home. If this story has brought you comfort, feel free to leave a quiet note in the comments. And if there's a story you long to hear next, something gentle, something real, I'd love to know. What story would you like me to tell you next? Sweet dreams, always.